introduction. It's possible you might have left out one thing. In the 4th grade, I won the trophy for best speller in my class. So, just set the record straight. Well,
That was on the list, but I,
okay.
I just
Wisely
give
edited.
them everything.
Wisely edited for time. So, no, thank you so much for that warm introduction. Thank you to the Humanities Center and Humanities Center staff, including Shamira, for helping to make the magic happen and make this all possible. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk today about an issue that I think connects very closely to important issues present in American civic life today. I want to start with an account of a story from a woman from Birmingham by the name of Lula Murray, a story that's preserved in the archives of the U.S. Department of Justice at the National Archives outside Washington, D.C. Mrs. Lula Murray knew her rights. This envelope comes from a 1923 letter that she wrote to then-President Calvin Coolidge. She was writing to President Coolidge because she had been turned down, and not for the first time, in an attempt to register to vote in Jefferson County, Alabama. Murray was a woman in her 50s. She hailed originally from Georgia. Her husband had steady employment as a mattress maker. And she took her problem straight to the top and argued in her letter to President Coolidge that her family had fulfilled its obligations to the nation, and now it was time for the federal government to fulfill its obligations to her and her family. In her letter, she noted that 2 of her brothers had answered the nation's call to serve in the Great War. That is, she said, in the nation's time of greatest necessity. She wrote that one, quote, gave his life in the defense cause in the time known as the World War to elevate to safe democracy. Her complaint, her reason for writing this letter, was that in Birmingham, safe democracy was not to be found. She continued, here I stand denied the Constitution rights in Article 14 and 15, and I being a woman, the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Murray was as fearless as she was firm. She wrote her letter in this time of Jim Crow in Alabama, and on the envelope, she put her name and return address, making it possible for her to be identified at a time when that potentially carried danger. And she sent it by registered mail. Lula Murray paired together the Reconstruction Amendments and the 19th Amendment in ways that scholars have not paid a great deal of attention to since. Like many African Americans of her day, she connected the success or failure of the Woman Suffrage Amendment, the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920, in securing voting rights for African American women, to the history of the 14th and 15th Amendments that were passed in the wake of the Civil War. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. It established that African Americans were citizens and established for the first time an express protection for voting rights for adult male citizens. 2 years later, the 15th Amendment was ratified. It proclaimed that, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis by the U.S. or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Backed by these amendments, in the living memory of many of her contemporaries, and quite possibly within her own, vast multitudes of African American men had voted in the post-Civil War South, in elections supervised by the U.S. military, and then in the reconstructed post-Civil War states. African American men's turnout in the South peaked at perhaps 90% in elections to call conventions to write new state constitutions, to select delegates to those conventions, and to fill local, state, and federal offices. Together with the 13th Amendment, prohibiting slavery, these three amendments have often been treated by historians as a set and known as the Reconstruction Amendments. The 19th Amendment has always been treated as a separate narrative, intersecting with the 15th Amendment in limited ways, as I'll show, but generally regarded as its own separate narrative. That said, Southern African Americans at the turn of the 20th century were far from satisfied with how the Reconstruction Amendments were working, in particular, the 15th Amendment. It took decades for the ineffectiveness of the 15th Amendment to become clear. After federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, the number of African American male voters dwindled. The Supreme Court gutted key provisions of the 14th and 15th Amendments with decisions in the Slaughterhouse and Cruikshank cases, giving opponents of black suffrage more legal room to maneuver. White supremacists rendered black men's votes moot through fraud and drove them from the polls with campaigns of intimidation and violence. States erected new procedural barriers to voting, such as cumulative poll taxes and erstwhile literacy tests. And finally, in a period that historian Michael Perman calls restoration, a period he dates between 1890 and 1908, Southern states, starting with Mississippi in 1890, concluding with Georgia in 1908, worked to settle what they called the race question once and for all by enshrining disfranchising techniques into the state constitutions that were being revised at the time. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, only a few African American men were still voting in the South. Often a community's so-called best men, often ministers in these communities. Many African Americans, Lula Murray among them, recognized that the 19th Amendment was erected on top of the rickety foundation of the 15th Amendment. And between the turn of the century and the 1920s, African American suffragists were determined to hold the nation accountable for both the 15th and the 19th Amendment. Historical accounts of the ongoing relevance of the 14th and 15th Amendments for the woman suffrage movement go silent after 1875. In 1875, the Supreme Court held in Minor v. Haberset that white suffragists would not find support for women's voting rights in the 14th and 15th Amendments. What they were arguing is that women were citizens, that the 15th Amendment provided, offered protection for citizens, and therefore women should be protected under its provisions. And the Supreme Court shut down that line of argument at that point in time. White suffragists abandoned the 15th Amendment as a strategy for enfranchising women, but African American suffragists did not, because for them, not only were black women's voting rights at stake, but also the voting rights of black men. If the women's suffrage story centers on the experiences of African American women as aspiring voters and anchors them in the context of their families and communities, both their story and the story of women's suffrage must be rewritten. The 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment become at once a failed strategy for enfranchising white women and an important step forward for enfranchising African Americans. And the suffrage struggles of African American women and men are connected. The implications of the 15th Amendment for women's suffrage were very much on the minds of contemporaries, both suffragists and also white supremacists who opposed them. Even as suffragists intensified their campaigns in the first and second decades of the 20th century, some white supremacists worked to repeal the 15th Amendment, trying to close the door once and for all to any path back to the ballot for black men. After 1910, as more states enacted women's suffrage and as momentum built for the federal amendment, black suffragists feared and white supremacists simultaneously hoped that the failure of the 15th Amendment to secure African American men's voting rights would foreshadowed the failure of a possible federal amendment to secure African American women's voting rights. As it turned out, both black suffragists and white supremacists were largely correct. After ratification in 1920, when federal action, in the words of Southern opponents, imposed women's suffrage on the states of the old Confederacy, the past proved to be prologue when black women went to the polls. The broad disfranchisement of African American men in the Jim Crow South seemed quite secure by 1910. By then, historian Michael Perman argues, the decades-long process of disfranchisement had, quote, reached its conclusion. Even so, the 15th Amendment remained intensely controversial in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and white supremacists worked to shrink its protections further still, and even to repeal it outright. Supporters of black women's suffrage fought simultaneously to acquire voting rights for women and to preserve and enforce the 15th Amendment, both campaigns at the same time. The 14th, and especially the 15th Amendment, were the target of repeated efforts at repeal in the 1900s and 1910s. In 1904, the House of Representatives debated whether the amendments were legally adopted and whether they should be repealed. Representative Thomas Hardwick of Georgia introduced resolutions for repeal and explained his purpose in a speech on the House floor in 1904. Quote, the 14th and 15th Amendments were adopted, if adopted at all, against the will of the majority of all people in the Union, by trickery and treachery in the North, and by force and violence in the South. His effort was stymied, but other Southern legislators picked up the call, including Representative Cotton Tom Heflin of Alabama, Senators Ben Tillman of South Carolina, and James Vardaman of Mississippi. They all continued to argue for repeal and called in 1911 for a national plebiscite to decide the issue. In 1916, Representative Thomas Sisson of Mississippi introduced a resolution to ask the Justice Department to bring to the Supreme Court a test case that would determine whether the 14th and 15th Amendments were, quote, legally adopted and are part of the Constitution, or as some white supremacist lawyers and lawmakers suspected, adopted in violation of other Constitution provisions. These repeal efforts came to naught, but they were not to be dismissed because they gained support outside the South and were part of a broad reconsideration of voting rights in the late 19th and early 20th century U.S. New York, in fact, in 1870 rescinded its ratification of the 15th Amendment when State Senator Boss Tweed, the Tammany Hall boss, took advantage of new Democratic majorities in both houses in Albany to reduce the voting strength of Republicans by reducing the number of black voters. But black suffragists did not have to look back to 1870 to see threats to the continued survival of the 15th Amendment, even in its attenuated state. White supremacists took to the road to spread their view that, quote, an ignorant, enfranchised Negro population, quote, was a danger not only to the South, but to the nation. Gertrude Bustill Mossell was a writer out of Philadelphia, and in 1900 she sounded the alarm. She was a journalist, a clubwoman, and a suffragist, the proud and politically active descendant of the Philadelphia African American family whose freedom predated the American Revolution. She reported on a set of public lectures being given by a group of visiting white ministers from Alabama, North Carolina, and Georgia. These men claimed to be experts on, quote, the American Negro. But Mossell charged, quote, these men want the 15th Amendment repealed. They want to be placed in a position to rule without the disgrace of shooting the Negro. The next year, a New York paper, the Brooklyn Eagle, called for the repeal of the 14th and 15th Amendments, arguing that the preservation of, quote, government and civilization required allegiance to a higher constitution than the federal compact. The debate over the legitimacy of African American voting rights continued as T. Thomas Fortune's New York Age in 1911 criticized what he called, quote, the running agitation for repeal of the 15th Amendment, both by members of Congress and by noted clergymen. Among them, a man by the name of Dr. William Hayne Level, who was a founder of Rice University and soon to be President Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to Guatemala. Concerned that upcoming elections might put then Governor Wilson in the White House, the Age argued that African Americans had ample reason to worry. If the Democrats had a good year in 1912, quote, the Negroes would be justified in expecting the most radical legislation in opposition to their civil and political rights guaranteed them by the 14th and 15th Amendments. The controversies over the 15th Amendment made their way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1915 reaffirmed a cramped interpretation of the amendment's capacity. In Gwynn and Beale versus U.S., the court both threw out grandfather clauses, that is a disfranchising tool that many states have used, saying that a person was not eligible to vote unless their grandfather had been eligible to vote. But it, at the same time, affirmed other kinds of restrictions on suffrage. At issue was Oklahoma's 1910 law that imposed both restrictions, both grandfather clauses and, in this case, a literacy test. The Supreme Court rejected in Gwynn the grandfather clause and said it was a repugnant repudiation of the 15th Amendment. Oklahoma's amendment, however, entangled both disfranchising techniques together. The court then expressly clarified that literacy tests did in fact comply with the amendment's requirements. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White delivered the court's opinion and declared that the literacy test requirement, quote, was but the exercise by the state of a lawful power vested in it, not subject to our supervision, and indeed its validity is admitted. The Gwynn decision has long been celebrated as a step forward for voting rights, but surely it also offered comfort to white supremacists by endorsing literacy tests as a restrictive device and affirming that the 15th Amendment did not, quote, change, modify, or deprive states of their full power as to the suffrage. The 15th Amendment's very existence was endangered just as the women's suffrage campaigns gained momentum, and African American suffragists took up both causes at once. Mossell wrote in support of women's suffrage as early as 1885, echoing in the pages of the New York Freeman newspaper John Stuart Mill's sentiment that, quote, the legal subordination of one sex to another is wrong. 15 years later, she used her pen to decry black men's disfranchisement and counted herself among those whose voice in politics was at stake. For Mossell, as for other African Americans of the day, ballots communicated not just an individual's political preference, but rather the broader will of the community. She wrote, now, if our colored men don't get united and look after the race interests, they will wake up some fine day and witness the repeal of the 15th Amendment. We have had the ballot, and lost it several times before in certain states. Now we have it nationally. But the South is the unit to disfranchise us, and the crusade is now begun in Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty, to take it away practically forever. In the we, she includes herself, right? Even though African American women have not been enfranchised. Adella Hunt Logan shared her concern. Logan, don't know what's Logan was from Sparta, Georgia. She was a professor at the Tuskegee Institute, and she had joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association as early as 1895. 10 years later, she laid out a rationale for black women's suffrage in the Colored American magazine, which was a leading forum for discussion of public issues by the nation's African American elite. Quote, after more than 30 years of trial, some statesmen, real and pseudo, have concluded that the 14th Amendment was a mistake. Logan began. At the same time, she said that the 14th Amendment remained on the books, And the amendment clearly stated that, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens of the U.S. and of the states in which they reside. She continued, in the ordinary affairs of life, women are regarded as persons. Why not treat them as such in questions of government? No, they are classed with minors, idiots, and paupers. That is, people who were dependents and lacked the capacity as well as the right to vote. Logan argued that African Americans, both women and men, needed the ballot even more urgently than the white Americans who already enjoyed it. Quote, if white American women, with all their natural and acquired advantages, need the ballot, that right protective of all other rights, if Anglo-Saxons have been helped by it, and they have, how much more do Black Americans, male and female, need the strong defense of a vote to help secure their right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? For African American suffragists, saving the 15th Amendment and extending the right to vote to women were two fronts in the same fight. The ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 pried open a crack in the edifice of white supremacy, putting the weight of the Constitution behind Southern Black aspiring voters for the first time in a generation. In the fall of 1920, newly enfranchised Southern Black women surged to the polls to press their claim that the 19th Amendment included them. African American men joined them, husbands, fathers, brothers, neighbors, some of them new veterans with proud records of service to country, with renewed determination to reclaim their voting rights. That fall and in the decade to come, some Southern African Americans in fact succeeded in registering and casting ballots. Many, however, encountered a situation all too reminiscent of the disfranchisement period of the late 19th century. Obstructionist tactics, threats, and sometimes violence as white supremacists worked to put down this fresh challenge to their power. And when Black women encountered these barriers to the exercise of their new rights, they complained that, just like the 15th Amendment before it, the 19th Amendment was being ignored. Lula Murray was one of those women. She did not give up, and she did not fight alone. Her 1923 appeal was one of a raft of letters written by honorably discharged African American veterans and their family members from the Birmingham area, asking the president to guarantee their constitutional voting rights. One of the letter writers, a man by the name of Arthur Ivy, worked in the mid-1920s as a gardener and introduced himself to the president in his letter as a veteran who, quote, had served in the USA Army. Indeed, service records indicate that he served in France in the 324th Service Battalion, a company that did forestry work, possibly clearing trees and building fortifications. Back home, he wrote to bring the violation of his rights to the president's attention. I am denied the rights and privilege of a citizen which is due me in Article 14 and 15 of the Constitution of the USA. My voting certificate was denied me on these conditions. We are segregated on account of race and color, and the Constitution forbids anyone being segregated on account of race and color. Letters by Ivy, Murray, and others, in fact, reached the White House, where President Coolidge's secretary, Bascom Slemp, referred them in routine fashion to the Justice Department. By the mid-1920s, they have an office and letterhead and are presenting their petition in a more formal fashion. Dissatisfied, the activists continued to mobilize family and neighborhood ties to push for Black access to the ballot box. In December 1925, they chartered their organization as the Ex-Soldiers Operative Association. The association was composed of several hundred colored members who had been in the last World's War, as they described themselves, were honorably discharged, paid, bonused, that is, received a payment after the war, and made poll tax-free for life. This is a critical point. Veterans were usually exempt from poll taxes, so that would have removed one of the barriers to African American men voting in the South. They had a national board of directors. They had a headquarters in Birmingham's Masonic Building, and the officers, including Lula Murray, who served on the executive committee as a committeeman, put forward their petitions to the president. They sent a fresh wave of letters in 1926, but this time, instead of making general appeals to constitutional justice, they named the Jefferson County Board of Registrars and its chairman, L.K. Bowen, as the proponents of, quote, a conspiracy to violate the Constitution of the USA. Murray and her fellow letter writers divulged only a few details of their most recent troubling encounter at the registrar's office. They testified in their letters that the registrar did not let them enter the building. Instead, he required them to, quote, make application on the outside doors, then later turned down every applicant. There apparently was more to the story, but at this point, Murray and her fellow letter writers all declined to go further. Quote, if the whole detail upon the merits of the subject was explained, this sheet of paper could not hold all the wordings. Within a matter of days, 17 other members of the association sent similar letters, each writer backing up his or her claim to the ballot by recalling their sacrifice and service during the First World War. I am a sister of a deceased ex-soldier, Murray insisted. The association followed up in February with a formal notarized petition to President Coolidge with 15 signatories asking for an investigation of Alabama's compliance with the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments, and reasserting that, quote, we stand ready to defend our country upon any patriotic call, as in the past, with particular reference to the World's War. The petitioners included Birmingham neighbors Gus and Alice Stewart, husband and wife, and Murray's brothers, Jim and Ozzie McNabb. The Ex-Soldiers Association got its investigation. This is the first page of the FBI report. In January 1926, the FBI interviewed Murray and the group's secretary, a man by the name of Jerry Merriweather, who worked in the 1920s as an insurance agent. The meeting took place at the association's Birmingham headquarters, and Merriweather testified in it on behalf of the group that, quote, despite the 15th article of the Constitution, they were hampered at the time of registration. He said that though they had fulfilled every requirement and met, quote, all the qualifications for voting, repeating the process over a series of years, the registrar had failed to add their names to the rolls. Murray added that in last year's attempt, quote, she had learned the 15th Amendment by heart and recited it to the registrar to no avail. The investigator was unimpressed. He found that though Murray and Merriweather were, quote, above the average, which is really an insulting way to offer a compliment, they, quote, they are troublemakers in exciting the mass of colored people to vote. Some African Americans, he maintained, had successfully registered in the city, and most who had registered had not bothered to cast ballots. Alabama law, he noted, even provided the opportunity for anyone who was turned down to appeal their denial. In the end, the FBI investigator concluded that the Board of Registrars had acted properly. Quote, investigation shows attempts to register, but qualifications not considered satisfactory to the registering officer. The U.S. Attorney for the North District of Alabama, a man by the name of C.B. Kenneman, was more sympathetic to the petitioners than the investigator had been. Kenneman reported back to Washington that Alabama law gave registrars, quote, wide discretion and power. I have absolutely no doubt, he wrote to Attorney General John S. Sargent. And in fact, I practically know that such power and discretion is very frequently exercised in a highly biased and unfair manner. Even so, Kennemer concluded that the actions of the registrars were legal and that his office had no recourse. Quote, I know of no action this office could take that would in any manner be calculated to rectify such practices. The federal government would take no action to enfranchise Lula Murray or any other black woman in the Jim Crow South. And much as African American men found over time that the 15th Amendment had failed to secure their voting rights, African American women were learning after 1920 that the 19th Amendment would also fail them. The controversy over the 15th Amendment from early in the 20th century lurks in American political discourse even today. In this historical moment, African American voting rights remain endangered. Certainly, modern day techniques for using ostensibly race-neutral election procedures to disfranchise in racially disparate ways draw from the old playbook established during and after Reconstruction. Today's use of restrictive voter ID laws to prevent fraud, for example, echo concerns about fraudulent black votes during the period that white supremacists falsely dubbed Negro rule. Modern gerrymandering reduces the power of black votes, much like the shift to at-large electoral districts did in progressive era cities. But even as these disfranchising techniques today go forward to challenge black voting rights, a more fundamental challenge has emerged in public discourse, one that one might think, given the distance from the Civil War and Reconstruction, that had been laid to rest. In November of last year, CNN aired a story about how then Republican candidate for the Senate from Alabama, Roy Moore, remarked at an earlier point that getting rid of constitutional amendments after the 10th would, quote, eliminate many problems. A claim that gave fresh voice to the century-old argument that the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments were a bad idea and maybe never even properly ratified to begin with. What T. Thomas Fortune's paper called in 1915 a running agitation apparently still continues even to this day. Thank you. Happy for questions or discussion? Sure.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for a really compelling talk. And I don't know if this truth doesn't make people want to get out and vote November 6th, and nothing will. Just, I'm a little verklempt, sorry. But I was just curious about the poll tax, and so which amendment was that a part of?
It was enacted by states,
I see.
by state legislatures, or sometimes enshrined in state constitutions around the turn of the century.
Gotcha.
So, and it was a practice where people had to pay a head tax, usually during the winter time, and get a receipt. And then when the election finally came around months later, they had to produce that receipt to prove that they had paid their taxes. And poll taxes were widely assessed. It was a tax that was assessed just like a property tax. So people were expected to pay them whether or not they were able to vote in the fall, or whether or not they intended to vote in the fall. And in many places, those taxes were cumulative. So that if you didn't pay it 1 year, the next year you owed double plus a fine. And so they very quickly became a financial barrier to participation. So, but part of the outrage is that, if, for example, someone who is in the South and African American and doesn't want to even want to approach voting, like just doesn't want to tangle with it because of fears of safety or whatever, they're still liable for the poll tax and considered in arrears if they don't pay it. So it was really problematic. But poll taxes were discontinued by some states in the mid-20th century and eliminated by constitutional amendment in the 1960s.
And so, sorry, one follow-up question then with the with veterans. being excluded, I would imagine then that would vary by state as well, whether,
That was a pretty common practice, though. And so you have all these African-American veterans returning from France in 1918, and they want to vote. And now the poll tax is no longer a barrier, but they're finding that other things become a barrier, so. Cool, good question.
Hey, hi. I'm not just waving at the question. I'm curious, so you have this really rich source base in these letters. And I'm wondering, because I know this is a much broader project, have you found similar archival evidence from other states or other regions that are, that coordinated? And are they is there a national sort of coordinated campaign happening? Or are you seeing these things happen regionally or at the state level? Or do you not know yet?
Well, the best documentation appears in the papers of the NAACP, which in 1920 does not know how the 19th Amendment is going to go, right, and see it as an opportunity. Du Bois, in the pages of the Crisis, endorsed the Women's Suffrage Amendment. There was a lot of support for it. And in the fall of 1920, they send researchers out in the field to find out what's going on, and they get these reports back and these testimonies. So to the extent that there were coordinated campaigns to try to address this, it was often done by NAACP chapters, but not always. There's some involvement by church organizations and other kinds of civic groups and veterans groups as well. But there's not a big national strategy. It's soon afterwards that the NAACP develops a broad strategy to try to address, in particular, the white primary, which is becoming the most important means for disfranchisement from the mid-1920s forward. But there are certainly mobilizations in pockets, apart from the NAACP, apart from veterans organizations, in order to register African American women to vote in the fall of 1920. There are massive campaigns in places like Jacksonville, where they succeed in registering about 6,000 African American women in the county. There are big mobilizations in Houston, in Galveston, in Richmond, Virginia, smaller collective efforts in probably, it's documented in about 15 cities in North Carolina, probably existed elsewhere as well. There are clear efforts at mobilization, and in dealing with the refusals, usually it's the documentary record is richest when it comes to the NAACP. So there may be other groups that are not as well preserved. So.
I have probably a naive question from an American history perspective. I'm struck by your connection of the three amendments. I found myself wondering why this isn't the standard way of looking at this, insofar as the people themselves that you are researching are explicitly connecting these amendments. In terms of the white supremacist resistance to African Americans voting, was there a resistance based on the 19th Amendment specifically? That is to say, were there resistance for white women voting? Were they being barred? That the 19th Amendment is also not legitimate?
Southern white men are largely being encouraged to vote.
Okay.
They're being told, look, you might not have wanted this and you might not have asked for it, but it's here. And in fact, there are newspaper accounts that tally the number of newly registered white women versus black women, and argue that, white women are going to be swamped by black women, and, just overrun at the polls, really invoking this narrative of Negro rule that was so familiar at the time.
So it remains a white supremacist resistance to these
Absolutely.
amendments and not a patriarchal resistance. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, race is very important in these mobilizations on both sides.
Okay.
So, and I mean, it seems like an obvious connection to make, to pair the 15th and 19th Amendments, but generally, the Reconstruction Amendments are handled on their own And the 19th Amendment is possibly linked with other progressive era amendments, or linked with reforms like prohibition, which is the 18th Amendment, and other kinds of progressive reforms of the time period. So they're seen as different time periods, but also the two of them are not well connected unless you're putting African American enfranchisement at the center of the narrative, right? Because for white women, the 15th Amendment is no help whatsoever after the Minor v. Happersett decision. So it really depends on how you're framing the narrative. So. And in accounts of suffrage, there are like accounts of women's suffrage, which tend to be largely white women's suffrage, and then there's this kind of like side narrative of African American women suffragists, like kind of an add-on or tacked on. But if you change the perspective and put that at the center, then you really do need to connect these elements, because they did. It also is, probably hasn't gotten attention because it links the suffrage stories of women and men, right? And keeps it from being this, purely woman suffrage story. So that's, probably another reason why it hasn't largely been seen this way before, so. Okay.
I have a couple of really technical questions, and you may not know the answers, but one of which is, just looking at the text of the 15th Amendment, it doesn't actually specify that states control the voting machinery at all. Is that elsewhere specified in the Constitution, or has it been part of U.S. electoral and political practice?
It's, the Supreme Court clarifies that in the Cruikshank and Slaughterhouse decisions. And it, prior to that, was largely regarded as relegated to states through the mechanism of the 10th Amendment as an unenumerated. But it was a power that, in particular, southern states guarded very jealously as part of a broad strategy as a tool to be used for white supremacy.
Yeah, it's Ann Gordon made an argument that was on Twitter, so I don't know if she published it elsewhere, but it was literally on that if we started sort of looking at voting as a national and federal right, that much of these mechanisms of disenfranchisement could not hold up, and that this was one of the great mistakes that has been made. But also interestingly, when I was looking at the text, because I wanted to ask an uninformed question, I raised a second question. The 14th Amendment in the second section actually says that you can reduce representation for a state if you restrict voting to any male citizen over the age of 21 years, and effectively only in their representation count, only count them for 2/3. And it strikes me that in the kind of regional conflict that often occurred in politics, why was this never attempted to be enforced? And why couldn't we actually try to enforce it now when we have states basically undertaking massive campaigns of disenfranchisement?
I don't know why it wouldn't work now, and maybe there's an attorney who can give us some insight into that. But at the time, as I said, it was Cruikshank and the Slaughterhouse cases that said that the rights enumerated in the 14th and 15th Amendment are, 14th and 15th Amendment only apply to rights of, quote, national citizenship, and then just very narrowly define national citizenship to be limited to things like interstate commerce and a couple of other things. It was very, very circumscribed. There wasn't, as I understand it, there wasn't a mechanism for a federal mechanism for enforcement with respect to some of these issues until the Voting Rights Act of '65, which created these provisions for supervising elections in designated states, in particular Section 5, which is what Shelby v. Holder invalidated. So the things that we're seeing, for example, in Georgia now, even in North Dakota, are very predictable consequences of Shelby v. Holder. You know, it's absolutely predictable. So I'm not sure how Justice Robert feels now in, you know, the claim that he made that, you know, there is clearly no need, there is no ongoing discrimination that would require supervision at this point. You know, those problems are solved. And I wonder what he thinks, whether he would stand behind that statement in light of what we're seeing now.
I also wonder about civil suit, or this notion of an external alliance, basically putting forward a legal case. Given the widespread use of disenfranchisement strategies across the United States and the overrepresentation of the very regions that are practicing the strategies.
I mean, it's not illegal to put restrictions on the suffrage. It's not, you know, it's not a universal right. You know, the ability of states to regulate access to the ballot is well recognized. What they can't do is do so in a discriminatory fashion. So when they impose.
The text of the 14th Amendment, second section, but when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for president and vice president, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of the state, or the members of the legislature thereof is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such a state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years and older. It actually asserts within that clause that this is a national right.
Legally, it wasn't understood that way. And I can't, you know, I wish that I could, you know, further articulate
No, I just,
the,
I think
the
it's
sort
an
of
avenue
legal
that could be
bases
thought
for
about.
these. You know, I know it was attempted, and I know the legal attempts failed. So.
The
you know,
Constitution says what the Supreme Court says it says.
Exactly, and the Supreme Court said that it didn't say that, or didn't mean that. So, those, you know, Cruikshank and Slaughterhouse are the key decisions, so. But one of the strategies for disfranchisement that has long been used in order to get around the prescription against a racialized disfranchisement is to implement a technique that isn't explicitly racial, but nonetheless has a disproportionate impact. So for example, with literacy tests, they knew they were going to disfranchise, you know, they're going to disfranchise not only African Americans, but whites as well. But they're going to disfranchise more African Americans than whites. And so it was a strategy. In the end, it doesn't matter to the white supremacists involved in this how many people vote. You know, it's not about pro-democracy, it's about an outcome. And
It's probably not a problem if a bunch of white sharecroppers aren't voting either, from the
Yeah.
perspective of the people who control the system.
They've got no problem with that, right? You know, it's not their point, it's not their first choice, but they can accomplish an end with something that is ostensibly race neutral, even though it clearly has disparate impacts. So, you know, disparate impact isn't enough to prove discrimination. So,
voting rights are not a fundamental right, according to Slaughterhouse and its progeny.
no, the federal government can't regulate, with very limited exceptions and boundaries, the state's ability to regulate access to the suffrage. It's not inherent, it's not.
So long as it passes the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause, essentially.
And the bar for that was very low, so. bear in mind that, through the 18th and through the middle of the 19th century, that suffrage and citizenship were divisible, right? That citizenship did not entitle one to suffrage, and there were many people who voted who were not citizens, and it was perfectly legitimate, right? 31 states had alien suffrage. Okay, it was about membership in a community and legitimacy and standing in a community, and not, official status as a citizen of the U.S. or a citizen of a state.
Well, when the Constitution was first passed, almost every state had property requirement
course.
for voting.
And had taxes that were the antecedents of poll taxes. So, but, citizenship did not necessarily entitle one to vote, and in a majority of states, non-citizens were enfranchised. So the two do not align neatly. We had that expectation, but that wasn't one at the time. So, good questions.
Do you see the requirement or the provision that you can't vote straight party anymore? You have to be very discriminating and pick and choose as another manifestation of the literacy test?
I think it's clearly expected to have a disparate effect, because there are some communities in which that's a more common practice than elsewhere. It'll also have these ancillary effects, because if people have to go down and mark every office all the way down the ballot, that's going to take longer. And in polling places that are understaffed and have long lines to begin with, it just further gums up the system and provides a disincentive for people to vote. So, it's one more obstruction in the process, and one that will have disparate impacts.
Combined with closing polling stations in
Of
certain
course.
neighborhoods.
Of course.
You create a gumminess in the system that can't be overcome, and is all completely legal.
It's completely legal, because it's not on its face racialized. So, voter ID laws, and you may have heard about in North Dakota. There was a court decision that allows a particular kind of voter ID law in North Dakota to stand, and it's one that requires people to show a government-issued photo ID that has the residential address on it. Apparently, as a matter of policy, the U.S. Postal Service doesn't deliver on Indian reservations. They don't have rural-free delivery on Indian reservations. So people have P.O. boxes, right? You go check their mail at the post office. So the post office doesn't offer mail service, and now you need a residential address in order to cast a ballot.
They haven't even named all their roads. There are
No.
people living on roads that have no names.
There you go.
And
So-
that was the result of electing a Democratic senator from the state who was disproportionately voted in by the Indian.
A reaction to.
Right.
A reaction to. Okay, so on its face, ostensibly race neutral, but has these disparate impacts, and in my view is intended to have exactly those impacts. So there are a few other people in North Dakota who will get thrown off the ballot because of that, but on balance, it's a partisan win.
I think the issue before the Supreme Court right now on whether or not we can force a cabinet member to testify plays into all of this.
How so?
In order to show that a statute that's on its face is not discriminatory, you have to show a discriminatory impact, or not impact, but intent. It used to be impact, now it's intent. And the only people that can talk about that intent, or that really know the intent, are the people that actually did it. So if they are protected from testifying, as is the case in a lot of these matters, including gerrymandering, it's very difficult to prove the intent, in which case the statute wins, the legislature wins over the rights of the individual.
Good deal. Yeah. That's all right. Apparently in Indiana, just one last note, apparently in Indiana, in order to get a birth certificate, you have to have a driver's license. In order to get a driver's license, you have to have a birth certificate. Close the circle. Close the circle, so anyway. Thank you so much.
So let's thank them
Coming
for
out,
her
so-
very sobering. Very sobering. Very sobering.